you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. And then he adds, and coming on the clouds of heaven. As if to say, you're going to kill me, but I'm coming back. That's a prophetic statement, a declaration of a coming judgment. And Jesus is claiming here to be that divine judge. He's telling this august assembly, this Sanhedrin, he's telling them that he is not on trial here, they are.
Imagine a courtroom where every rule is broken, where justice is thrown out the window, and the verdict is predetermined. This was the setting for the trial of Jesus. These trials were rigged, filled with corrupt leaders and false witnesses, and all took place under the cloak of darkness. Yet, despite the injustice, Jesus willingly endured it all. Keep listening to find out how each trial violated Hebrew law and what it means for your understanding of his sacrifice.
Jesus is going to have 3 trials before the Jewish leaders, and he's going to have 3 trials before the Roman leaders. 6 unlawful trials of Jesus. What I want to do is organize these 3 around 9 different Hebrew laws that were broken in order to bring about the verdict they wanted. Now, we know from John's gospel that Jesus is bound in the Garden of Gethsemane, but he's actually taken next to the home of Annas, that old corrupt former high priest. He's called a high priest until he dies, as was their custom. But John writes in chapter 18 this, so the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. That takes place in the garden. First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now we go back into history, we discover that Annas was high priest from 86 to 15. He was now too old to serve, even though he was supposed to until he died. That was the way God set it up. The Romans now determined who would occupy that seat. It was a bought position. Whoever would be most favorable to the political leader, whoever would, grease the skin of the political leadership with kickbacks from the temple, and that was Annas. So he actually continued to determine who would hold that position. In fact, we know he had 5 sons, and all 5 would serve as the high priest, and that tells you something. In fact, we just read here that Caiaphas is his son-in-law who is currently occupying the office. So this old man, in fact, one author called him the godfather of the religious system there in Jerusalem. So Annas, he wants the first crack at Jesus. He knows Jesus is going to be arrested in the garden. He's already ordered the soldiers, you bring him to my place first. So when Jesus is brought there, Annas sitting in his pajamas, it's 3 a.m. He's ready. I kind of picture him being in his high priestly garments. He's going to intimidate this backwoods rabbi from Galilee. Oh, but he's going to meet his match and more. Now, to stand before the former high priest was nothing less than a legal hearing, but this is all illegal. And the first law broken, let me give it to you, is this one. Trials, according to Hebrew jurisprudence, trials were not to be held during Israel's national festival. And this is Passover season. This is the time when spiritually minded people would be praising God and thanking God and remembering the deliverance of the people back from Egypt in centuries earlier in time. Not Annas. He didn't really care about that. He wants to interrogate the man who'd caused him a lot of high blood pressure and probably a lot of heartburn. So when Jesus arrives, Annas just sort of attacks with one question after another. We're not giving them, we're just given the fact that he did it. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? These are loaded words here. You can't hold a secret hearing. Jesus says, I've never said anything in secret. You see, he's exposing the fact that Annas is violating the law. You can imagine nobody at that home, those soldiers are not dozing off here. All the men in this room knew Annas was a crooked old man. They knew he had no regard for the law, but you just wouldn't say that out loud. Jesus just did. John records that one of the soldiers immediately slapped Jesus in that awkward silence for basically saying that Annas was crooked. Annas at that point knows, and this only taken a couple of minutes here, that he's outwitted, he's cornered, he's convicted. So he lets this soldier settle the score with a slap to the face of Jesus. So with that, though, he just kind of sends Jesus away. I'm going to send him over to my son-in-law's home. Matthew's account fills in some details. Luke focuses more on Peter's denial. Matthew gives us a closer look at the trial. And they're in the process, by the way, of breaking another Hebrew law, even more officially. Now, let me give it to you. Trials could not be held secretly at night, but publicly during the day. Now, we know that at Caiaphas' house, this is a trial in every respect, more formally, in fact, because Matthew records in chapter 26 these words, verse 57, then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and elders had gathered. That's code for members of the Sanhedrin. This is going to be an illegal trial. Out of sight, nobody around to look, apart from the soldiers, those people on the payroll, the temple police, away from any possible supporters of Jesus who might step up and object. Hey, this is unlawful. This is illegal. This is the work of darkness under the cover of night. The Sanhedrin was composed of 70 men, 23 priests, 23 scribes, they were attorneys at law, and 23 elders. And then the high priest evened it out, and he served as the president of the council. Now, some of them have gathered, probably more than likely, the closer friends of Caiaphas. Caiaphas wants to reach a decision, and he wants to do it quickly. So they're actually calling for witnesses, and that's another indication that this is a trial. And with that, they're going to violate another law. Number 3, let me give it to you. 2 witnesses must come forward and agree on the charges. Now, never mind that there shouldn't have been a trial, but given the fact that there was, they're going to keep the law regarding witnesses. Isn't it interesting? They violate some laws and they keep other laws. Sounds like you and me. That's what they're doing. The law of witnesses is recorded in Deuteronomy 19, and Moses writes it this way. Only on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. Of course, they're going to have to agree on every point. Now, I want you to know this. The Sanhedrin operated differently in some respects than our courts do today. In the Sanhedrin, there were no prosecutors like we know them today. And that's because the witnesses served as the prosecutors. The Sanhedrin, if anything, was supposed to provide defense, asking questions. In fact, the witnesses were typically questioned separately by members of the Sanhedrin earlier, before the trial even began, to ensure that their testimony was consistent, that they weren't making anything up, that their stories matched up, that they tell the truth, that they're not making anything up. So with that in mind now, I want you to just let this text sink in for a moment. Matthew writes, now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony. They're seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. Imagine, they're actually looking for liars. They're hoping two of them can agree with their story and step forward. The trouble is, all these liars that keep coming forward can't keep their stories straight. They keep guessing, the wrong tire. None of them are consistent. Many false witnesses came forward until probably after you had a little coaching, in some back room, and finally two witnesses step up with the same details. Look at Matthew's gospel account now, chapter 26 and verse 60. At last, two came forward and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. Now, Jesus said this, it's recorded back in John chapter 2. He was speaking metaphorically. He's referring to his body as the temple, and he's actually referring to the fact that he's going to rise from the dead in 3 days. But these witnesses, they're scrambling for something. They twist it and then accuse Jesus, get this, of threatening to bring down the temple structure. I mean, this setting, when so tragic, it'd be even more comical. In fact, Matthew even writes with a touch of sarcastic humor. At last, two came forward, as if to say, finally, they found two men who could keep their stories straight. But what a crazy story. Hey, he said he's going to destroy the temple. He's evidently going to take a hammer out there, and nobody's looking. He's going to start chiseling away at it. And then he said after he destroys it, he's going to build it back in 72 hours. Really? That's it? That's the best they can do? Now, there's a reason the Sanhedrin has a hard time getting somewhat intelligent men to bear false witness against the Lord. I mean, where can you find good witnesses at 3 a.m.? Here's another law that was broken. False witnesses were to bear the same penalty as the accused. Moses writes in Deuteronomy 19, if a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, the judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother. You testify falsely in court, and you're going to go to jail for the same amount of time as you'd hoped that other fellow went to jail. That had a way of curbing false witnesses from taking the stand. Listen, there should have been a dozen more crosses out on Golgotha. But here's their dilemma. There's no evidence of wrongdoing. They have no witnesses to a crime. Jesus never broke the law. He's innocent. He's pure. He's perfect. So these corrupt religious leaders who come up with this ridiculous story keep pressing forward and breaking one law after another. Here's another one, number 5. The high priest was not allowed to question the accused. He simply presided. But Matthew's gospel lets us know here that Caiaphas doesn't stay in his seat. He leaps to his feet. And the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus remained silent. Now, don't misunderstand, he will eventually speak. But at this point, the Lord is basically reminding Caiaphas that he is breaking the law himself by demanding that Jesus answer a question. And Jesus at that moment isn't going to dignify him with an answer. Now, at some point in time, Luke's gospel indicates that Jesus is handed over, more than likely after they reach their verdict, to these Roman soldiers and these temple police until daybreak. They know that this trial is unlawful. They know where they're going to go. They know what they're going to decide. So they're going to wait until dawn to just fake it. They're going to bring Jesus into the official courtroom to act like, well, they're just now starting at daybreak. But while these soldiers hold Jesus for those few hours, Luke records they beat him. Luke writes in chapter 22, verse 63, now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, prophesy, who is it that struck you? And making him guess. Eventually dawn arrives. Picture Jesus bloodied now even more, bruised, his jaw probably broken, maybe eyes swelling. He'll be on a cross in a matter of hours. Luke writes here in verse 66, when day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council. Now the language here reveals that the entire Sanhedrin is meeting and Jesus is being taken to the hall of judgment. Now this courtroom was located inside the temple complex. It was officially called the Chamber of Hewn Stone. Now the name came from the fact that the stones were carefully cut off-site and then fit together to form the walls and the pillars. This court was built to signify, to represent the solid granite stability of truth and justice and devotion to the law of God. That's what it stood for. The men sat in semicircles. The accused would be brought into the middle. Imagine the irony that the cornerstone is being rejected in the chamber of hewn stone. Doesn't take long for another Hebrew law to be broken. Here it is, number 6. The accused were never required to speak for their own defense. You could add that certainly never to incriminate themselves. Luke writes here again in verse 66, and they led him away to their council, that is this great hall. And they said, first thing they did, if you are the Christ, tell us. If you are the anointed Messiah, tell us. Jesus didn't have to speak. We've adopted the same law, by the way. We call it pleading the what? The fifth. You don't have to speak in a way that might incriminate yourself. Earlier with Annas, Jesus had remained silent. But let me tell you, now it's time. Now it's time. It's time to help the Sanhedrin find him guilty of something more significant than the ridiculous story that he's going to take a hammer out there and try to bring the temple down. He's going to help them find something worthy of death. Verse 68, Jesus responds, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. Jesus is essentially saying, you've had prophets before and you ignored them. Many of them you killed. You don't want to hear the truth. You don't want to hear about me, whether I'm anointed. You don't really care. They didn't want the truth about Jesus. And it is true, Jesus is pulling their mask off. Your eyes, he says, are effectively closed. That's the same in our world today. Same issue. The problem isn't that our world around us needs more evidence of a creator God. It isn't that our world needs some miracle. Think of what they ignored. It isn't a problem with lacking evidence. The problem is they know the evidence will demand repentance. So don't tell me. You have friends like that. You have coworkers like that. Maybe family. Don't tell me. Don't talk to me about that. Leave me alone in the darkness. Jesus keeps talking. Verse 69, but from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, you say that I am. In other words, I am the Son of God that you are saying in that question. The word in the original language for you is emphatic. One translator could paraphrase it this way: you in this courtroom have just confessed who I am, even though you won't believe it. And look at what the Lord just claimed. He's combining two texts from the Old Testament. Daniel chapter 7, which refers to the Son of Man approaching the throne of God. Psalm 110, which talks about him being seated in the place of divine authority. So Jesus takes these two passages and he combines them, and he effectively says, I am the person from Daniel 7, and this is my position from Psalm 110, seated in the place of divine authority. I am the Son of Man, and I am seated on God's throne. The Sanhedrin immediately knew what Jesus was claiming: virtual equality with Elohim, both in person and in posture. And they respond, are you saying that you're the Son of God? Are you claiming to be deity robed in humanity? Yeah, that's worthy of death. And then Matthew says Jesus even adds this little phrase. I love this little phrase. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. And then he adds, and coming on the clouds of heaven. As if to say, you're going to kill me, but I'm coming back. I'm coming back on the clouds of heaven. That's a prophetic statement, a declaration of a coming judgment. And Jesus is claiming here to be that divine judge. He's telling this august assembly, this Sanhedrin, he's telling them that he is not on trial here, they are. Same with your world today. And so they say in verse 71, well, what further testimony do we need? We've heard it ourselves from his own lips. They're so grateful that he's claimed to be God in the flesh, the Son of God. Let me tell you what they should have done at this moment is fallen down on that stone floor and worshiped him. But they didn't. Matthew Henry wrote 300 years ago, there is none so blind as those who refuse to see. That's our world. Instead of falling down to worship him, Matthew records Caiaphas calling for a vote, and then the high priest tore his robes. They would start from the collar and work down over their heart. That was a symbol that their heart was broken. What a hypocrite. You have heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment? They all answered in unison, he deserves death. Now with that, they break 3 more laws. Let me give them to you very quickly. Number 7. The sentencing of the accused was to follow a day of fasting and reflection. Capital cases were never decided at the moment. They were supposed to spend the day considering the evidence, reviewing it, praying, fasting. Somebody's life was essentially on the auction block. They often would pair up and review the evidence. No hesitation here. Let's vote. Another law was broken. The sentence of death would be dismissed if the court was unanimous. Now, in our world today, this is different. A unanimous vote is required for the death penalty. But here in Israel, they believed, it's really interesting to me, that they believed that a unanimous vote meant something went wrong. I mean, how do 70 men agree on anything? So something misfired here. Maybe they didn't look at the evidence. Maybe there was a prejudiced heart against the accused. And they even wrote that perhaps one of them lacked mercy. So a unanimous vote of the Sanhedrin allowed the accused to immediately go free. But not Jesus. One more law. most horribly, here it is, the evidence of judicial prejudice or bias would overturn any decision of the court. We'd call it a mistrial today. If a jury member was bribed, if it was proven, that the judge mishandled some technicality, if an attorney withheld evidence that was critical to the case, any sign of unfairness, any sign of bias, animus, and the case was thrown out of court. Well, were these Supreme Court justices ruling with fairness and justice? Just watch what they do next. They descend on Jesus just like the Roman soldiers had done earlier. Matthew writes, then they spit in his face and they struck him and some slapped him. Can you imagine the Supreme Court of the United States condemning a criminal to die and then robes and all getting up from behind the bench and coming down, encircling the accused? That's what the Sanhedrin just did. 70 men surrounded him, spitting on him, hitting him, cursing, mocking him. What's the greatest insult you've ever had to bear? He took it all here without a word, no word recorded. He was tried before this high court so that you will never have to be tried before the court of heaven. He was treated with the injustice of mankind so that you and I will never have to face the justice of God. He is unlawfully condemned to die so that you and I can have the legal right to live with him forever as children of God.
Take comfort in knowing that he was condemned for you, ensuring your place in God's eternal kingdom. This is Wisdom for the Heart with Stephen Davey. Today's message is called The Unlawful Trial of the Lamb. Stephen's passion is for equipping men and women for ministry, which is why he founded Shepherd's Theological Seminary. If you're interested in graduate-level theological training, STS offers what you need. You can study in person at the Cary, North Carolina campus and complete the program in 3 years. With both in-person and online options, you can study wherever you are. Visit wisdomonline.org/STS. Join us next time here on Wisdom for the Heart.